Hey guys, this is for me. It's Monday afternoon, so just the day after preaching the sermon Sunday. And I said in the sermon that I don't have enough time today. I will put it in the newsletter. So here you go. This is a little video of what was sort of briefly mentioned and then left out yesterday as we were teaching. If you were here Sunday, we were in the book of Luke and we were reading the words of Jesus as he was invited to a meal. And he starts telling the Pharisees and the Sadducees that they're guilty of some things and they have a problem with sin and they need to do something about that sin. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, their position is basically like, hey, we look good. We're doing the best we can. We're on the good guy side. And Jesus is saying you're actually more like those on the bad guy side. And he quotes a story at the end of that passage that we looked at in Luke. He says, all the way back to Abel and Zechariah, you are on the side of those who killed these men. You're not on the side of Abel and Zechariah. And I don't know about you, but usually when I'm hearing a story where there's a very obvious good guy and a very obvious bad guy, I tend to believe I'm on the good guy side. I tend to believe I don't have the same problems as those bad guys. And Jesus is answering them. He's saying, no, you're more on Cain's side. You're more on Joash's side with Zechariah. We'll mention him here in just a moment. And so I made the conclusion, and the whole message was to say that we as humanity, we are image bearers of God, but we're deeply flawed. We're flawed specifically with a problem that the Bible calls sin. And we just explored what that meant. And because Jesus mentioned Zechariah and Abel, I was curious. As I was studying for the message, I was curious, like, why those two people? And as I studied it, I found that the rabbit hole got deeper and deeper and deeper. And I'm not going to pretend that I got to the bottom of it, but I am going to say that this video is going to be a little bit of a different speed than a Sunday sermon. This is going to be more Bible study. We're going to just kind of maybe meander through all the clues and the hints and see what this riddle has at the end of it. If you don't have time for this whole video right now and you just want to, hey, what's the main point? The main point is this, that God has a great memory and he remembers the sins of people that have not yet been answered for, and he will cause payment to happen. He will cause them to have to answer for it. He has a great memory for the sins, but he also has a great memory for his own promises and his own covenant. That the same God who is a righteous judge is a redeemer who is willing to buy back his people and to create and enter into covenant relationship with them. And as Christians, we benefit from that covenant relationship that Jesus has brought. So how do we get there? What is the Bible study? What is the mystery of Abel and Zechariah? Let me remind you of what Jesus told the Pharisees and the lawyers when he mentioned these names. He said, therefore, also, this is, by the way, if you want to look this up later, if you want to take notes, this is probably going to be one of those with a lot of note opportunities. And we're in Luke chapter 11, verse 49. It says, therefore, also, the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be required of this generation. So the generation that Jesus is speaking to, he says, hey, from the foundations of the world, God is going to require payment now. He's hinting, of course, at his cross, that he is the one who will make the payment. But at this time, they don't know. Why does he mention Abel? And why does he mention Zechariah? So that's where I started studying. Couple of facts about these two people specifically, and then we'll turn to some passages and read it together. Abel and Zechariah are both what we would call today martyrs. A martyr is someone who's killed for their faith. Specifically to these two men and many other martyrs in the Old Testament, these are people who are trying to tell others who should be followers of Yahweh how to worship him rightly. And the people that they're talking to don't like this instruction, and instead of conforming their behaviors to match the right ways of worship, and instead of maybe even curiously looking into it themselves, like, well, maybe we are wrong. Let's check. Let's ask God. Let's read, scriptures. Let's see what's there. They take, option 3, which is, let's just kill this guy. Let's get rid of him. He's the problem. We're not the problem. We're the good guys. And so the people who are evil, they think that they're good, and they go silence these men. Both Abel and Zechariah are both voices that are trying to steer the people back into right worship with God, and the people that they're talking to, the audience, silences them instead. So Abel is, of course, one of the first children born to mankind, born to Adam and Eve, all the way back in Genesis chapter 4. I find it interesting. I don't know that it's relevant for this conversation, but the name Abel means breath or vapor. It is a hint at how fragile life is, or just life itself. The breath is the breath of life, especially in early parts of Genesis. And what happens if you don't know the story of Cain and Abel? Cain and Abel are brothers. They both go to worship God, and they worship God in 2 different ways. Abel's way of worship God accepts and receives, and Cain's way of worship God rejects, and it's not appropriate. It's not the way that I want to be worshiped. And Cain becomes angry about this. He becomes bitter. It says that his face is fallen. He's very down. And God warns him before he even kills his brother. God warns him, like, hey, you've got a problem that you need to deal with right now. I want to read it here. It's in Genesis chapter 4. I'm going to start reading in verse 6. It says, the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. When God warns Cain, Cain is already angry at his brother, but he hasn't sinned yet. The warning is that you're about to. That sin is crouching at the door. And what sin wants to do, Cain, if you're listening, is it wants to overtake you. It wants to rule over you. You need to stop it right now in its tracks. You need to subdue it. This is the first time the word sin is mentioned in the Bible, and it turns out that sin becomes the problem that humanity has to deal with for the rest of ever. If you haven't read the Bible, this is going to be a spoiler alert. Cain doesn't listen. He doesn't subdue sin. He caves into it. He takes his brother's life. And afterwards, when he's having to answer to God about this, or when God is pronouncing his judgment on him, Cain is overwhelmed with how bad this judgment is. If you go down to Genesis 4, verse 14, it says, verse 13, Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. So Cain says to the Lord that his punishment is greater than he can bear. That word punishment in Hebrew is avon, A-V-O-N in English, and it's translated either punishment or iniquity. And it's all over the Bible. It occurs in the Old Testament 231 times, this idea of punishment or iniquity. And Cain looks at the punishment that he is due, and he tells God, it's too much for me to bear. I can't carry this punishment on my own. And the Lord shows him some mercy. If you can go read the rest of Genesis 4 and just see how the Lord shows him mercy and protects him from being murdered himself and sends him on his way. This word iniquity is all over the Bible. It's all over the Old Testament, and it's a problem because we can never really afford it. Cain even looks at it. It's like, I can't afford this. And it's really impossible to read about iniquity and not think of some of the passages in Isaiah that talk about iniquity. They talk about avon, this word avon. It shows up in the book of Isaiah like 25 times, over 20 times. I didn't write it there, but it's a bunch. Just take my word for it. I think it's like 25 times in the book of Isaiah. And one of the most famous passages in Isaiah, one that you probably know from Christmas times with the Bible, is in Isaiah 53. And I just want to read about this avon, this iniquity. Who if Cain can't afford the punishment, who can afford the punishment? It says this about the future Messiah, who at the time of Isaiah is unknown. In Isaiah 53, verse 4, it says, surely he, that's that future Messiah, he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. He was crushed for our avon, our punishment. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity, the avon, the judgment of us all, the punishment of us all. That even in the Old Testament, as we read about the story of Abel and Cain, Cain can't handle the weight of the sin, can't handle the weight of the iniquity. And God says, I'll take care of it in the future. And even in the time of Isaiah, which is thousands of years later, he's looking forward to, like, someone's going to come, this future Messiah is going to come, and God's not just going to lay on this future man, the iniquities of Cain. He's going to lay on this future man the iniquities of us all, and he's going to trade our iniquities, our punishment, for his peace. He said about peace, he says, upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. He was crushed for our iniquities, and he brings us peace. He brings us shalom. Even in the story of Cain is this hint that God remembers the payment is too much for us to bear. Someone has to come and take it. And you can't miss. That's wild to me. Abel is it's a heartbreaking story, obviously, but it's a story that reminds us that God has a long memory, remembering both the sin of people, but also his ability to redeem people. Okay, Zechariah. Let's talk about him. Zechariah is the last martyr, the last person killed for trying to tell people how to worship God in the Old Testament. He is a priest in the temple. He, just to set the stage, it's the children of Israel, the Israelites, have gone into captivity, into Babylon, into exile. They spent their time in exile. Now they've returned back to Israel, and they rebuilt the temple to worship God, which is a big deal. This is where Nehemiah is building the temple, if you know that story. Zechariah is the priest in this new temple, and he looks around at the people that aren't worshiping God rightly. They're just making it up. They're doing what they want. They're doing the kind of things that people did in Babylon. They're doing the kind of things that people did before they went into exile. And he's like, guys, you've got to stop. You need to remember God. Interestingly, the name Zechariah means Yahweh remembers, which is one of our points from last week, is that God has this very long memory, and his name means that Yahweh remembers. I want to read what happens to Zechariah in 2 Chronicles 24, starting in verse 20. It says, then the Spirit of God clothed Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the priest, and he stood above the people and said to them, thus says God, why do you break the commandments of the Lord, so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he has forsaken you. He is being a prophet. He's standing up, he's telling them, he's like, guys, we've got to worship him rightly. We don't get to make this up. Stop breaking the commandments. Worship God rightly. Verse 21. But they conspired against him, and by command of the king, they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Lord. Thus Joash the king did not remember the kindness that Jehoiada, Zechariah's father, had shown him, but killed his son. And when he was dying, he said, this is Zechariah's last words in the Bible, may the Lord see and avenge. May the Lord see what you've done and avenge. Now, this is not someone who dies quietly. You'd probably be mad too. Like, if you're trying to help people worship God and they silence you, you know? He wants God to see what they've done and to avenge him. And Jesus, he's quoting, 500-600 years later. Yep. The time of avenging, has come. That word avenge, in Hebrew is darash. It's used, usually, to translated as avenge, or to have a reckoning. It's like a moment where, I'm trying to think of an example. It's like a moment where it's come time to pay up. It's like, hey, we're going to have a reckoning. It's now time to clear these books. It's a moment of reckoning. The first time that this word darash is used is in the story of Noah. The story of Noah is a story where God looks down at the people, sees all of the violence of the people, and then he judges all of the people with a flood. He just wipes out all of creation. It's like a decreation moment with a flood, save just Noah and his family, just those few people, to rebuild creation. And at the end of the flood, in Genesis chapter 9, I want to read something from that. We get this word darash. This idea that God's going to avenge. Says this specifically, he's talking about killing people, even in this moment. He's like, here's the consequence for killing people. He says, verse 5, chapter 9, verse 5. And for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning, a darash, we say, from every beast, and I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man, I will require a reckoning, a darash for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. Even in this first mention of the word avenge, darash, we get this idea that God's image has been tainted. And because of the value of what God's image is, God corrects for it. He takes sin seriously. We tend to try to tame sin. We would be wise to listen to the words that God gave Cain, that sin is crouching at the door seeking to overtake us. We're not going to tame that sucker. We need to kick it out. We have to get rid of it. Here's the beauty, though, is that Genesis 9 is after the flood is over. It's after Noah and his family have been rescued, and he's reminding them how serious sin is, and then he immediately goes into his covenant with them. I mean, a verse later, in verse 9, he says, "Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast on the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. For it is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." And he establishes what we call the Noahic covenant, the covenant with Noah. In both the story of Abel and the story of Noah and the story of Zechariah, we have this God who remembers who he is. He remembers the value of image bearers. He remembers that nobody's able to rescue us except him, and he's the one who redeems. When Jesus mentions to those lawyers and those Pharisees that the time of reckoning is in this generation, it should have caused their knees to quake. It should have caused them to think, which payments aren't due? All the way to Abel? Are you kidding me? That's a lot of sin. And that's kind of the point that Jesus is making, is that they have tamed in their minds, they've tamed sin that it no longer affects them. That's an other person problem. And Jesus is saying, you really need to start cleaning the inside of your dish, in Luke 11. You really need to know that you are also in need of redemption. Listen, if you've watched this video, which is now longer than I anticipated, you see this rabbit hole, how deep it gets. And the end conclusion should be this: my sin and your sin is devastating. We can't get away from it without it being paid for. And we have to come to grips with how important God thinks that this is, how important he thinks his image in us is, that he doesn't want it tarnished in any way. He wants us to represent him well in any sense, small or big, whatever we classify those as, is a problem in representing perfection, which is who he is. And so Paul, he says that for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, all we like sheep have gone astray. He's quoting Isaiah, what I just read in Isaiah 53 when he says that. But every one of those threats, every one of those descriptions of how bad the condition is, has a hope for how good the solution is. And so just to quote our friend, was it Thomas Watson? Something Watson? Till our sin be bitter, Christ won't be sweet. As a result of going down this rabbit hole, may we just ponder that we have a big problem, but we have a bigger solution. Hopefully that increases our worship. Hopefully that increases our sobriety in thinking through how we act, how we behave, how we treat, in fact, other image bearers of God. And may it not be said of us like it was some of those Pharisees and lawyers that you think you're on the good guy side, but you're behaving like the bad guys in the story. May we be more humble than that. Maybe we be purified by the work of Jesus. So long video. I hope that you are growing. I hope that you're well. But I'm going to end it there.